I remember that night vividly. The bridge loomed ahead like the spine of some massive beast, its iron ribs twisting out of the darkness and stretching over the river's oily current. A few hours earlier, I would have laughed at the stories, at the old-timers in the diner with their hushed tones and wild eyes. The Goatman, they had whispered, lived under that bridge. A local legend, they said, an old folk tale designed to scare kids away from staying out too late. I had shrugged it off, dismissing their warnings as the kind of tales small towns spin to make themselves feel unique. But here I was, regretting every step. The air felt different on the bridge, like walking through a veil of static. I could taste metal on my tongue. It was unsettlingly quiet too, not just an absence of sound but a muffled stillness that swallowed everything, the gentle lap of the river below, the faint rustle of wind through the distant pines, even my own footsteps on the damp planks. I forced myself to keep moving, but every creak beneath my boots sounded wrong. The flashlight in my hand sputtered weakly, casting jittery cones of light that barely penetrated the mist. Midway across, my beam fell on something that made me stop cold. At first I thought it was an animal print, huge and cloven, pressed into the damp wood. But as I looked closer, I realized there was something human about it too, as if a massive hoof had merged with a man's foot. The edges were sharp and deep, too fresh for comfort. I swallowed hard and shined the light around, but the fog curled protectively, keeping its secrets. I tried to shake off the dread creeping up my spine. Maybe it was a prank, I reasoned. Someone could have carved these prints to keep the myth alive. That's when I heard a low, throaty bleat that cut through the mist. It wasn't the sound of any goat I'd ever heard. There was something inhuman about it, a depth and resonance that vibrated in my chest. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the iron beams and disappearing into the dark. I told myself to keep walking, to not turn back, but my legs had other ideas. I stepped backward, almost tripping over my own feet. The flashlight flickered again, then went out entirely. Panic set in. I smacked it against my palm, trying to coax it back to life. Darkness pressed in, oppressive and thick. The river below gurgled softly, a reminder of how high up I was. I kept smacking the flashlight until finally it flared to life. For a moment I felt a wave of relief. Then I saw it. A figure stood just at the edge of my light. Its shape was wrong, distorted by the haze, but I could see the outline of broad shoulders, a hunched posture, and something protruding from its head, twisted horns that spiraled out and glistened wetly. It didn't move, didn't even flinch at the sudden burst of light. My chest tightened, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I couldn't. My legs were rooted in place, paralyzed by a fear so primal I felt like prey. The figure shifted, one slow, deliberate step. I saw the glint of eyes too far apart, catching and reflecting the beam. It took another step, the wood creaking loudly under its weight. My breathing quickened, shallow and frantic. I tried to remember the stories, anything about what this thing was supposed to be, how it hunted. But all I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. The Goatman or whatever it was stopped, just out of reach, the mist clinging to its outline. Then it did something I'll never forget. It leaned down and pressed its hand, if you could call it that, onto the plank. I watched as clawed, blackened fingers left deep gouges in the wood. It tilted its head, as if curious, and let out another bleat. This time there was a hint of a laugh beneath it, something dark, mocking. I stumbled back, desperate now. I felt the rough texture of the bridge's railing and gripped it tightly. My options were bleak. There was no way I was going into that water even without whatever this creature was. It felt like a grave. But turning my back on it seemed worse. The figure didn't move as I sidestepped along the railing. My flashlight sputtered again, and I felt the heat of panic flush my skin. I couldn't lose the light. It stepped closer, and for a terrible moment, I saw it in detail. Mottled fur covered parts of its body, but it was mixed with patches of sickly pale skin stretched too tight over muscle. Its face a grotesque mask of human and goat features twisted together, bared yellowed teeth. The eyes were the worst, dark pits that seemed to drink in the light and reflect back nothing. I tried to scream, but it caught in my throat, a strangled gasp. That's when I heard something else, a faint scraping sound from beneath the bridge. It was rhythmic, like metal dragging against metal. For a split second, I thought it was an echo of my own fear. But it grew louder, a slow climb toward the surface. Whatever it was coming up from below, climbing, and somehow I knew it was in league with the thing in front of me. I turned and ran, bolting for the far side of the bridge, legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. The wood groaned and rattled under each stride, and I could hear that scraping sound keeping pace beneath my feet. The air was cold and damp, stinging my face as I ran. I glanced back only once and saw the shape of the Goatman loping after me, its movements unnaturally fluid, like it was gliding across the planks. I didn't make it all the way across. One of the boards gave out beneath my weight, a rotted trap that splintered instantly. My leg plunged through, and I felt a sharp pain as the jagged wood cut into my thigh. I screamed, trying to pull myself free, but I was stuck fast. The flashlight spun out of my hand and clattered away, its beam dancing wildly before going dark again. Splinters dug into my palms as I clawed at the wood. My breath came in short, panic bursts. From the corner of my eye, I saw the Goatman slow its approach, savoring the moment. It tilted its head again, and I could almost swear it was smiling. The scraping from below intensified, and I felt the vibrations through the wood. Something wet and cold brushed against my trapped leg, a clawed hand, reaching up from the depths. I thrashed, kicking out with my free leg, but whatever was beneath the bridge held fast. The grip tightened, and I felt pressure like iron bands squeezing my calf. I let out a raw, desperate yell, adrenaline spiking through my body. I dug my fingers into the splintered planks, trying to hoist myself out of the hole. The jagged wood bit deeper into my flesh, but I didn't care. All that mattered was escaping whatever nightmare had crawled up from below. Above me, the Goatman stepped closer, each hoof-cloven step echoing like a death knell. It moved slowly, methodically, as if relishing my terror. Its horns caught the moonlight, twisted like ancient roots. I could see every twitch of its muscles beneath its taut skin, every droplet of mist that clung to its fur. It crouched, lowering itself to my level. For a long, terrible moment, we locked eyes. I saw something dark and ancient in its gaze, a predatory gleam, a hint of something that delighted in human suffering. Then it spoke. The voice wasn't what I expected. It was low and rough, but oddly melodic, like a distorted mimicry of human speech. "You came," it said, each word dripping with malice. The Goatman tilted its head, studying me with an unsettling curiosity. "They always come." Before I could process its words, the thing beneath the bridge yanked hard. My leg wrenched downward, and I felt the flesh tearing. Pain shot through me like lightning, blinding and nauseating. I choked back a scream and kicked again, landing a solid blow against the clawed hand. It released me for a heartbeat, and I seized the chance. With a surge of strength born of desperation, I pulled myself up, dragging my injured leg out of the hole. Blood streamed down my thigh, soaking into my jeans. I barely had time to move before the Goatman lunged. It was fast, faster than anything that size should be. I rolled to the side, feeling its breath hot, rank, and fetid rush past my face. It struck the ground where I'd been moments before, claws splintering the wood. I scrambled backward on hands and knees, trying to create distance. My fingers brushed against something cool and metallic, my flashlight. I snatched it up and swung wildly as the Goatman advanced again. The beam of light caught it full in the eyes. It hissed a sound like steam escaping under pressure and recoiled, shielding its face with an arm. I didn't waste a second. I turned and limped as fast as I could, ignoring the searing pain in my leg. My vision blurred from tears and sweat, but the opposite end of the bridge was close now, tantalizingly close. Behind me, the Goatman roared. It was a sound that cut through bone and marrow, filled with rage and frustration. I could hear it charging after me, its heavy footfalls shaking the planks. The scraping noise from below resumed, this time faster, frantic. Whatever creature had tried to drag me under wasn't finished. I reached the end of the bridge, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. Just beyond the edge, the ground sloped downward into thick forest, an escape route, but one fraught with its own dangers. I hesitated, glancing back one last time. The Goatman stood at the bridge's edge, silhouetted against the misty glow of the moon. It didn't cross onto the solid ground, as if some invisible barrier held it back. It paced, claws twitching, and let out a low, guttural laugh that chilled me to the core. "You can't leave," it said, the words slithering into my mind like a poison. "This place is mine. You're already marked." I stumbled into the woods, branches clawing at my clothes and skin. The trees closed in quickly, blocking out the moonlight. My breathing came in ragged gasps, each step sending fresh waves of pain through my leg. I knew I needed to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the bridge, but exhaustion and blood loss were catching up with me. I collapsed against a tree, trying to steady myself. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the oppressive silence that had haunted the bridge. I realized then that the Goatman wasn't alone, it had allies in this darkness. Shapes moved between the trees' shadows that seemed to pulse and writhe. My eyes struggled to focus, but the fatigue blurred everything. A sudden rustling to my left snapped me out of my stupor. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, heart pounding. 2 yellow eyes blinked back at me from the underbrush, and then another pair, and another. Dozens of eyes watching, waiting. The air grew thick with the scent of decay and wet earth. Something slithered through the leaves, and I saw pale, elongated limbs moving with inhuman grace. Panic surged again. I forced myself to stand, teeth clenched against the pain. Whatever surrounded me was closing in, a ring of nightmares waiting to strike. I took a tentative step forward, and then the world spun. My vision darkened, and the ground rushed up to meet me. As consciousness slipped away, I heard the Goatman's laughter, distant but clear, echoing through the trees like a promise. I woke to the taste of blood and dirt in my mouth. The forest pressed in around me, a tangled mass of twisted branches and clawing roots. For a moment I hoped it was a nightmare, that I'd wake up safe in my own bed. But the ache in my leg, the coppery tang on my tongue, and the oppressive silence all screamed that this was horribly real. I pushed myself upright, wincing as fresh pain flared through my torn flesh. The trees were different now, closer, darker, as if they had moved while I was unconscious. I checked my surroundings. The flashlight lay in the dirt beside me, cracked but somehow still working. The beam flickered weakly, casting jittery shadows that danced across the underbrush. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The air was cold, biting through my sweat-soaked clothes. I turned the light in a slow arc, searching for any sign of movement. The memory of those eyes in the dark made my skin crawl. Something rustled in the leaves. I froze, listening. The noise was soft, almost delicate, like a footstep deliberately muffled. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, my pulse thundering. For a moment, I saw nothing but shifting darkness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, a shape darted between the trees, a pale, elongated figure, too fast to track. My breath caught in my throat. They were still here, whatever they were, watching, waiting. I took a cautious step backward, trying to ignore the burning pain in my leg. My mind raced, grasping for a plan. The Goatman hadn't pursued me beyond the bridge, but these other things seemed less restrained. I couldn't stay here, surrounded. I needed to move to find some kind of shelter or higher ground. As I turned, a low hiss filled the air, like steam escaping from a pressure valve. It came from everywhere at once, echoing through the trees. My flashlight flickered again, the weak beam threatening to give out entirely. I gripped it tighter, my knuckles white. The hissing grew louder, more insistent. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, quick, darting shapes that seemed to vanish the moment I turned to look. My chest tightened. They were toying with me. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. "Don't panic." A branch snapped behind me, and I whirled around, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The light caught a fleeting glimpse of something pale, a hand, reaching from the shadows. It recoiled instantly, as if burned. The hiss turned into a low, guttural growl. Whatever these creatures were, they didn't like the light. It was a fragile advantage, but it was all I had. I backed away slowly, keeping the beam sweeping in wide arcs. The growling subsided, replaced by more rustling, more movement. They were flanking me, tightening their circle. I needed to move, and fast. I turned and limped deeper into the forest, each step a jolt of agony. Blood seeped from the gash on my leg, leaving a trail behind me. The trees seemed to close ranks, their twisted branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. I tried to stay focused, to push down the fear threatening to swallow me whole. The ground sloped upward, and I forced myself to climb. I slipped once, catching myself on a root. The flashlight wobbled, nearly falling from my grasp. Panic surged. If I lost the light, I'd be at their mercy. I pressed on, dragging myself up the incline until I reached the top of a small ridge. There I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. For a few precious moments there was silence. The oppressive stillness returned, but I knew it was a lie. They were out there, waiting. I scanned the woods, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The ridge gave me a slight vantage point, but it also meant I was trapped if they attacked en masse. I needed to find a better place to make a stand or a way to escape entirely. A faint glow caught my eye, far off through the trees. It was dim, flickering, but unmistakable a fire. My heart leapt. Fire meant people, or at least it meant light. I forced myself to stand, using the tree for support. I couldn't afford to rest. Whatever was out there wouldn't wait long. I stumbled toward the glow, fighting to keep my balance on the uneven ground. As I drew closer, I saw it more clearly: a small campfire, surrounded by a crude ring of stones. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly tempered by caution. The fire was too small, barely more than embers. No one was tending it. The ground around it was disturbed, the leaves trampled as if by a struggle. I stepped into the clearing, the light from the fire casting long, flickering shadows. There was no sign of whoever had built it. I moved closer, feeling the faint warmth on my face. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe they had fled, leaving this behind. Maybe I could stoke the fire, use it to ward off whatever was hunting me. Then I saw the symbols. They were carved into the stones surrounding the fire, intricate patterns that made my eyes ache to look at. Some of the lines were filled with dark, crusted stains. Blood. The air around the fire felt wrong, heavy and charged. I stepped back, suddenly afraid. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap. A twig snapped behind me, and I spun around. The flashlight flickered, casting its weak beam into the trees. The shadows pressed closer, shifting, moving. I caught glimpses of pale limbs, gaunt faces with hollow eyes. They were closing in. Panic surged, and I kicked at the stones around the fire, sending one of them tumbling. The symbols broke, and for an instant, there was a flash of light, a searing, blinding brilliance that lit up the entire clearing. The creatures shrieked, a chorus of inhuman wails that tore through the night. I shielded my eyes, the flashlight dropping from my grasp. When the light faded, I was alone again. The clearing was empty, the fire extinguished. The oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. But I wasn't fooled. They were still out there, lurking in the dark, waiting for me to make a mistake. I retrieved the flashlight, now flickering even more erratically, and limped out of the clearing. I needed to keep moving. There had to be a way out of these woods, a road, a cabin, something. Anything but this endless darkness. As I stumbled onward, a faint sound reached my ears, a low, rhythmic tapping. It was distant, but unmistakable. Metal on metal. I didn't need to see it to know what it meant. The Goatman was still watching, still hunting. The tapping grew louder, an unnerving cadence that seemed to echo both through the trees and deep within my bones. I kept moving, pushing myself through the underbrush, each step a struggle against pain and exhaustion. The rhythmic clanging reminded me of a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, as if marking time until the inevitable. The Goatman was coming, and it was in no hurry. My leg was a mess. Blood had soaked through my jeans, and every movement sent fresh waves of agony up my thigh. I stumbled and fell more than once, catching myself against rough trunks or clawing at roots to stay upright. The flashlight flickered again, and I realized it wouldn't last much longer. I needed to find another light source or shelter, anything to keep the darkness at bay. The forest seemed alive now, whispering with unseen voices. Shadows moved between the trees, darting closer whenever my light faltered. I turned in desperate circles, sweeping the beam around me, but the pale, gaunt figures remained at the edges of my vision. They were waiting for the light to die, for me to collapse from exhaustion. I couldn't give them that satisfaction. Then I heard something new, a faint, lilting melody carried on the wind. It was soft, almost comforting, like a lullaby sung in a distant room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tune pulled at me, coaxing me forward. I shook my head, trying to resist its pull, but my body moved of its own accord. My feet dragged me through the woods, toward the song. As I stumbled deeper into the forest, the trees grew taller and more gnarled, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. The air grew colder, each breath visible in the faint glow of my dying flashlight. The melody grew louder, clearer. It wasn't just one voice but many, overlapping in a dissonant harmony. I could almost hear the words now, though they made no sense, a jumble of old languages and half-remembered phrases that spoke of loss, of hunger. The ground sloped downward, and I followed it blindly, my mind clouded by the song. I barely noticed the ancient stones jutting from the earth, half-buried markers that formed a rough circle around a hollow. The ground dipped sharply in the center, forming a pit that reeked of decay and mold. At the edge of the pit, the pale figures stood, their eyes empty sockets that oozed black ichor. They parted as I approached, creating a path. I stopped at the edge, my legs trembling. The song faded, replaced by silence so deep it pressed against my ears. I wanted to turn and run, but my body refused to obey. I was a puppet, strung up by forces I couldn't see or understand. The pit yawned before me, and from its depths came a sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated the ground. The Goatman rose from the darkness, horns glistening and eyes blazing with a malevolent light. It climbed the edge with a predatory grace, never breaking eye contact. Behind it, pale hands reached up from the pit, clawing at the earth, but the Goatman paid them no mind. It stepped onto solid ground, towering over me. "You have been marked," it said, each word a knife that twisted in my chest. "You crossed my threshold, you belong to me." It reached for me, its clawed hand outstretched. I raised the flashlight, but the light was nothing now, a flickering ember in the face of darkness. The Goatman grinned, showing too many teeth. Its breath washed over me, hot and fetid, filled with the stench of rot. Then something snapped inside me. I wasn't going to die here, not without a fight. I swung the flashlight with all my strength, aiming for its eyes. The beam flared, brighter than it should have, blinding both of us for an instant. The Goatman roared, a sound that made the pale figures shriek and scatter. I took my chance, stumbling backward, away from the pit. The ground beneath me trembled as if the earth itself was alive, writhing in agony. I ran, or at least I tried. My injured leg gave out, and I fell hard, the wind knocked from my lungs. The Goatman's roar echoed through the forest, shaking the trees. It was furious now, no longer toying with me. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline dulling the pain. The flashlight was gone, lost in the chaos. Darkness closed in around me, thick and suffocating. I heard the heavy footfalls, felt the ground shudder. The Goatman was coming, and it was close. I reached out blindly, my fingers brushing against rough stone. I turned and saw what I had stumbled upon, a crude altar, carved with the same symbols that had surrounded the fire. Bloodstains marked its surface, old and fresh. Desperation drove me to climb atop it, my hands slipping on the slick rock. The symbols flared to life, glowing with an eerie blue light. The Goatman stopped, just beyond the altar's reach. Its eyes narrowed, and for the first time I saw something like fear. It hissed, claws scraping against the ground. The pale figures gathered behind it, their empty eyes watching. They wouldn't cross the altar's boundary. "Your tricks won't save you," the Goatman snarled. "You are already mine." The light flickered, weakening. Whatever protection the altar offered was fading, and I didn't know how long it would hold. I had no plan, no hope. The Goatman circled, waiting for its moment. I could feel its hate, its hunger. And I knew this was only the beginning of its game. The light of the symbols on the altar pulsed like a heartbeat, casting sickly blue shadows across the clearing. I stood atop it, swaying, blood dripping from my torn leg. The Goatman circled just beyond the altar's boundary, eyes burning with a mix of rage and triumph. Behind it, the pale, gaunt figures lurked in the shadows, shifting and swaying as if tethered to some unseen force. The air was thick with their whispers, a chorus of unintelligible words that scraped against my mind. The altar's protection was weakening. I could feel it, like a thread fraying under too much strain. The glowing symbols dimmed with each pulse, their light barely keeping the Goatman at bay. It knew this too, its lips curled in a twisted smile, revealing jagged teeth. It tapped its claws against the ground, a mocking mimicry of the tapping I'd heard on the bridge. Desperation clawed at me. I had to do something, anything, before the last flicker of light went out. My mind raced, searching for answers. The altar was a barrier, a thin shield between me and the thing that wanted to drag me into the pit. But why? What gave it power? My eyes darted to the symbols etched into the stone, the same patterns that had surrounded the fire. They were ritualistic, ancient, meant to hold something at bay. The goatman stepped closer, testing the boundary. The light sputtered, and for a heartbeat, its clawed foot crossed the line. It jerked back, hissing in pain. I felt a surge of hope there was still something keeping it out, but it wouldn't last. I needed to act before it failed completely. My hands fumbled over the altar's surface, tracing the symbols. I didn't know what I was doing, but I could feel a faint warmth beneath my fingers, as if the stone itself was alive. I pressed harder, channeling my desperation into the marks. The air grew colder, the whispers louder. The goatman's eyes narrowed. It knew I was trying something, and it wasn't pleased. Futile, it growled, voice like grinding stone. You cannot escape. Ignoring its words, I focused on the symbols, willing them to hold. I thought about the bloodstains, old and new, that marked the altar. Blood seemed to be a key. The idea made my stomach turn, but I had no choice. Gritting my teeth, I pressed my wounded leg against the carvings. Pain shot through me, white-hot and blinding. My blood seeped into the grooves, and the symbols flared, bright and blinding. The pale figures shrieked, covering their faces. The goatman staggered back, smoke rising from its fur. It roared, the sound a mix of pain and fury. For a moment I thought it might retreat, but instead, it lashed out, clawing at the ground, sending dirt and stones flying. It wouldn't be denied. The symbol's light dimmed again, and I knew it wasn't enough. The altar needed more than just blood. It needed intent to sacrifice, an offering. I didn't know how I knew this, but the realization settled like a weight in my chest. The altar was a conduit, a relic of an ancient struggle that I'd stumbled into. It wanted power, and I had nothing left to give. The goatman saw my hesitation and laughed a cruel, mocking sound. Your spirit is weak, it said. You will be broken. I shook my head, trying to banish the despair creeping in. I couldn't let it win. I forced myself to think. The stories, the warnings from the locals, they had spoken of a curse, of something that haunted the bridge. Was this altar part of that curse? A place of binding, perhaps, or a last line of defense against whatever evil had taken root here? My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden surge of movement. One of the pale figures stepped forward, breaking from the others. Its movements were jerky, as if it struggled against invisible chains. It raised one hand, pointing at me, then at the altar. Its eyes dark, empty voids met mine, and I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't a random gesture. It was trying to tell me something. What do you want? I whispered, my voice raw. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it lowered its hand and drew a line across its throat, a silent command, or perhaps a warning. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The altar wanted a sacrifice. But not just any sacrifice, it needed a life. The pale figures were bound to this place, trapped by whatever ancient force had cursed the land. They couldn't leave. They couldn't rest. But I could set them free. No, I muttered, shaking my head. There has to be another way. The goatman took another step closer, its eyes burning with cruel amusement. It knew my dilemma. It wanted me to break, to surrender to despair. The pale figures pressed closer, their whispers rising to a crescendo. I was out of time. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face. I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to become part of whatever darkness had claimed this place. But survival was a cruel motivator. I reached out, grabbing the nearest pale figure. It didn't resist, didn't struggle. Its skin was cold, brittle, like paper soaked in water. I dragged it onto the altar, my hands slick with sweat and blood. The symbols blazed to life, searing my vision. The pale figure convulsed, its mouth opening in a silent scream. Light erupted from its body, illuminating the entire forest. The goatman howled, claws raking at the ground as it was forced back. The pale figures writhed and shrieked, their forms disintegrating into tendrils of smoke. The light grew brighter, blinding. I felt a rush of heat, then cold, then nothing at all. When it faded, I was alone. The altar was cold beneath me, the symbols dark and lifeless. The Goatman was gone. The forest was silent. I collapsed, the weight of everything crashing down. I had survived, but at what cost? The pale figures were gone, their fate sealed by my hand. I'd become part of the curse, part of the darkness that clung to this place. In the distance, a faint tapping began again, metal on metal. The Goatman's warning echoed in my mind. You are already mine. I lay there for a long time, sprawled atop the cold altar, as the world settled into an oppressive stillness. The tapping in the distance was faint but persistent, a reminder that whatever victory I thought I had achieved was hollow. I'd forced the Goatman back, but it wasn't gone. It would return. It always returned. Slowly, I forced myself to sit up, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. My leg was a mangled ruin, and blood caked my skin. But I was alive. The pale figures were gone, their whispers silenced, but the price of that silence hung over me like a storm cloud. I had given the altar what it demanded, a life, and in doing so, I had stepped into the heart of its curse. I had become part of the darkness that lingered here. The forest around me was different now. The trees stood tall and still, their branches no longer clawing at the sky. The air was heavy, but no longer suffocating. I could almost believe that whatever malevolent force had held sway here was gone, that I had somehow broken its hold. But the tapping continued, relentless and mocking. I needed to move, to get away from this cursed place, to find help or, at the very least, shelter. My fingers scraped against the cold stone as I pulled myself to my feet. The pain in my leg was almost too much to bear, but I gritted my teeth and took a step forward, then another. The forest watched in silence, as if waiting to see what I would do next. As I stumbled away from the altar, the symbols etched into its surface flickered, just for a moment. It was a warning, a reminder that the darkness hadn't been defeated, only delayed. I couldn't linger here. The tapping grew louder as I moved, as if whatever lay at the heart of the curse was drawing me back. I forced myself to ignore it, to push through the trees and follow the faint glimmer of moonlight that filtered through the canopy. Each step was agony, but I pressed on, driven by the primal need to escape. The forest seemed endless, its paths winding and treacherous. More than once, I heard rustling in the underbrush, saw shadows darting between the trees. The pale figures were gone, but other things still moved in the dark. I don't know how long I walked before I stumbled into a clearing. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over a crumbling structure, a small, dilapidated cabin. Its roof sagged and the windows were shattered, but it was shelter. I limped toward it, hope flaring in my chest. The door creaked open at my touch, revealing a single room filled with dust and decay. It smelled of rot and mildew, but it was better than the open forest. I collapsed onto the floor, the weight of exhaustion finally catching up with me. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I might pass out, but then I heard the unmistakable creak of floorboards, as if something heavy was moving just out of sight. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. The cabin was dark, the moonlight barely piercing the grime-covered windows. I strained my eyes, searching for movement. The creaking stopped, replaced by a low, rasping breath. It came from the far corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. I reached for my flashlight, only to remember that it was gone, lost somewhere in the forest. My heart pounded as I forced myself to speak. "Who's there?" The rasping breath grew louder, a wet, choking sound. I could see the faint outline of something hunched in the corner, its form hidden by darkness. It shifted, and I caught a glimpse of pale skin stretched over bone. My stomach twisted. Whatever it wasn't human, or at least it wasn't anymore. Slowly, the figure stepped into the moonlight. Its face was gaunt, its eyes sunken and hollow. Patches of hair clung to its scalp, and its skin was marred with deep, weeping sores. It stared at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I recognized it, not the face, but the eyes. They were the same eyes as the pale figures in the forest. "You did this," it whispered, voice cracked and broken. "You fed it." I shook my head, backing away until I hit the wall. I didn't have a choice. The figure's mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. There is always a choice. It took another step forward, and I saw the chains around its wrists and ankles, old and rusted. They clinked softly with each movement, a haunting echo of the tapping that had followed me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was one of the cursed souls, bound to the altar and the Goatman's domain. I had freed it from one prison, only to bind it to another. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't know." The figure lunged, chains rattling. I scrambled to my feet, pain forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. It moved with inhuman speed, its limbs contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I dodged, barely avoiding its grasp, and stumbled out of the cabin. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and biting. I ran, my injured leg screaming with every step. Behind me, the figure emerged from the cabin, its eyes glowing with a sickly light. It didn't stop at the threshold. The chains around its limbs dragged through the dirt, leaving deep furrows. The tapping was everywhere now, louder than ever. I realized with sickening clarity that it wasn't just a sound. It was a call, a summons for whatever darkness had been awakened. I ran until my lungs burned, until the trees blurred into a wall of black. The tapping followed, a relentless beat that refused to let me go. I tripped, falling hard onto the forest floor. The ground was cold, damp, and unyielding. I turned onto my back, staring up at the canopy. The moon was gone, hidden behind clouds. The tapping stopped, replaced by silence so profound it felt like the world had ended. And then the Goatman stepped into view, its horns silhouetted against the sky. It smiled, and I knew the truth I had never escaped. The altar had bound me as surely as it had bound the others. The curse was mine now, inescapable and eternal. "You are already mine," it whispered, and the forest swallowed me whole.